of why it is that the government has thought to bring forward this bill. It was forced to it because of consumer outrage, because consumers felt that they were being dealt with in an unfair fashion by insurance companies. Now, as we all know, various steps have been taken prior to Bill number 1. There was a lot of debate in this House. There was, after we endlessly chased the government to do it, a reference to the Utility and Review Board for them to scrutinize the rates that the insurance companies were charging. We know when the Utility and Review Board was asked to think about it, that they did make some comments about this question of soft tissue injuries. Because recall that this is at the core of what the insurance companies are saying. It's at the core of what leads to Bill 1. The insurance companies are saying soft tissue injury awards are much too high, therefore our costs are too high, therefore we're losing money on our investments, on our business in Nova Scotia, therefore we have to put up premiums. That's their story. That's what they keep repeating. And essentially, at the core of it, is some kind of suggestion that the courts have been too generous in their awards for soft tissue injury. And we've certainly heard suggestions from the insurance industry that having lawyers represent people, particularly on a contingency fee basis, has driven up the costs. And we have to ask ourselves whether this is the true explanation of why it is that costs have gone up. Because if it's not the true explanation, then the government is offering us a bill that is addressing a problem that's the wrong problem. They would be addressing the wrong problem because they are saying, let us cap at $2,500 the amount that individuals can be paid for so-called soft tissue injuries. In fact, to use the language of the bill, of course, it's minor injury. Minor injury is the term in the bill. Well, what's the evidence for this? Well, let's start first with the global picture of the finances of the companies, because they're saying we're losing money. They're saying we pay out more in payments than we take in premiums. Well, now, I have drawn the attention of the members of this House on previous occasions, and I will draw their attention again to what it is that the federal government, through the Department of Finance, has to say about this branch of the insurance industry. That is to say, the property and casualty branch, not the life insurance branch, but the property and casualty insurance branch. If one goes to the Federal Department of Finance's website and reads their description of the different branches, what used to be known as pillars of the financial system of Canada, what they say about insurance companies is that they always pay out. They typically pay out they typically pay out more than they take in premiums. That this is how their business operates. How do they make money? They make money through their investments. So when we hear the complaint of the insurance companies that they pay out more than they take in premiums, this is standard operating fact for those companies. What it really comes down to is that they have been losing money on their investments. But you know what? Everybody has been losing money on their investments in the last few years. The stock market and the bond market are both picking up again, and indeed, the profitability of those companies is going up enormously. We just saw their latest quarterly statement, which showed that their profits are up 5 times over what they were a year ago, and that's attributable to the recovery of their investments in the stock and bond market. Well, good for them. But it is no reason for us to take pity on their financial state and to bring in a bill which will add weight, add financial weight, that is, do harm to the taxpayers, the ratepayers, the citizens of Nova Scotia. That's just wrong. And I say that if there are fluctuations in the profitability of the insurance companies, too bad. That is the way it is. Profits go up, profits go down. Globally, these companies have been profitable. What they're complaining about is not that in the aggregate they haven't been profitable, they're complaining that they haven't been profitable enough. They want more. It's not just that they're in the black on their balance sheets. They want to be better off. They want to increase the value of their stocks for their stockholders. They want to increase the dividends that are paid out to their stockholders. They want to increase the benefits and salaries for their executives and their board members. Very nice, but it doesn't have to be at our expense here. There is an alternative. But that's what this bill is about. This bill says, let us take more seriously the profits of these companies than the burden of premiums that Nova Scotians have to pay, and let's take those profits more seriously than premiums by reducing payouts. That's what the bill says. It's right there. It's as clear as it could possibly be. We're not interested. Has this really been scrutinized? Has it really been looked at in Nova Scotia by any independent agency? Well, I mentioned a minute ago that there was a set of hearings in front of the Utility and Review Board. Of course, just by the by, I note that the member for Cape Breton West seemed to think that his party had been represented at these hearings and that ours took no part. Of course, if he actually looks at the decision of the board, it lists on the opening 2 pages all of the participants. It lists the Insurance Bureau, and it lists the individual insurance companies, and it lists the Coalition Against No Fault, and so on, and it lists the NDP caucus. It certainly doesn't list the Liberal Party. They took no part. Small point, a minor point, but I thought we should correct the honourable member for Cape Breton West, since I know he likes to be accurate in all of the facts that he puts before this House. But when I went back and I looked again at the report of the Utility and Review Board, when they commented on soft tissue injuries, it's a very fascinating passage. And, Mr. Speaker, I've extracted the page and a half from the report of the Utility and Review Board, and I want to table it for all members in case anyone wants to follow along with this, because I am going to read into the record a few paragraphs from this report. Here's what they had to say about soft tissue injuries. I quote, "While pointing out in its pre-filed evidence that there are a number of factors which account for the current level of insurance costs, among them the level of taxation, general inflation, insurance fraud, and healthcare costs, IBC placed particular emphasis on the cost of settling claims for soft tissue injuries such as whiplash. IBC referred specifically to the Nova Scotia Private Passenger Automobile Insurance Tort Bodily Injury 2001 Closed Claim Survey, prepared for it by Exactor and published in January 2002. The report was filed with the board in IBC's response to Board IR 21. The study reviewed 540 completed claim files, each of which involved a compensation claim for bodily injuries. The study concluded, among other things, that soft tissue injury claims represented 70% of all bodily injury claims reviewed in the study, and 56% of the money paid out. the majority of this money was for pain and suffering rather than for economic loss. Based on the study, IBC concluded that, quote, further quote, the primary factor behind rising auto insurance claims costs was a significant increase in the cost of settling less serious soft tissue injury claims, and specifically the cost of pain and suffering awards. End of quotes. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Utility and Review Board was very cautious in how it treated this study and how it treated the assertions of the Insurance Bureau of Canada about soft tissue injuries. They pointed out that this study, the survey, was not extensively examined at the hearings. And indeed, they said that the board makes no finding with respect to the closed claims study. They said further that the study may warrant more critical scrutiny for the purpose of any future discussion of possible steps to mitigate increasing insurance premiums. Those are very cautious words, Mr. Speaker. There was some evidence in front of the Utility and Review Board, which was the only real opportunity in this province that we have had to look in detail at some of these claims of the insurance company. But look what their study says. Look what it is that's being said by the different participants in this debate, and see if we can just keep clear the facts. Because again, I suggest that if the government has misunderstood the true basis of the problem, then Bill 1 ought not to be in front of us. And again, the focus here is on this question of soft tissue injuries. The Insurance Bureau of Canada claims that there has been a huge increase in the payouts for soft tissue injuries. And at the same time, there is a different view of the facts. The different view of the facts is put forward by the lawyers who actually practice in this area of the law, who litigate in this area of the law, who go to court about this kind of matter. And what they have said is that, in fact, the Nova Scotia courts are, if anything, relatively stingy about payouts for soft tissue injury. Indeed, the courts here don't operate in a jurisprudential vacuum when it comes to soft tissue injury. The Supreme Court of Canada has told the courts, the lower courts, what they can do, what are the limits, what are the parameters of payouts for soft tissue injuries. But even within those parameters as set by the Supreme Court of Canada 20 and 30 years ago, the Nova Scotia courts are pretty stingy, according to the lawyers who litigate it. And you know what? That's my view too. I endorse that view. I think the lawyers are right on this. That's been my experience when I practiced in this branch of the law. But here we have two different statements. On the one hand, lawyers are telling us the courts are stingy and the payments are low. On the other hand, the insurance companies are telling us that the payouts are too high. Is it possible to reconcile these two statements? Well, I want to suggest a way in which those two statements can be reconciled. On the one hand, I think we do have to believe the lawyers who practice in this area of the law, who tell us that there has not been a huge increase in the amount of the payouts for soft tissue injuries in Nova Scotia. They've gone up with inflation, that's about it. On the other hand, we can probably also believe the insurance companies that they have paid out more for soft tissue injury claims. Note the important fact that in most of these cases, those are negotiated settlements that the insurance companies have arrived at themselves instead of going to court. What they're telling us, and this explains the difference in the facts, what they're telling us is that they, the insurance companies, have driven up the costs of payouts and therefore their own costs of doing business because they're paying more for soft tissue injuries. They're not litigating it. They're not finding frauds. They're not going to court and taking a hard line. They're saying, we've wimped out. They're saying to us, we have driven up the costs of doing business here and elsewhere by paying out more. Well, you know what? If that's the case, there's something wrong. We shouldn't be dealing with that by a bill that caps the benefits that should otherwise be legitimately payable to the citizens of Nova Scotia for this mandatory purchase. What kind of collusion on the part of the two other parties is this? How can they expect the public to believe that this is good public policy? There is an alternative. The alternative is as laid out in Bill 4. The alternative is a publicly owned and administered, non-profit, no caps system. And again, if I may point something out for the benefit of members of this House based on the flailing remarks of the honourable member from Cape Breton West about Bill 4, it's a short bill because, of course, the opposition is not the government. The opposition could not bring forward a bill to set up a public automobile insurance corporation because it would be a money bill. It's simply beyond the rules of this House and unconstitutional for the opposition to bring forward a money bill. What we did bring forward was a bill that required a study and that was carefully stated to be subject to appropriations by the government. That's their purview. We couldn't have done more, but we have said what it is that we would like to do, and the models do exist out there. Well, who's going to be happy with Bill number 1? The two parties that are supporting it are going to be happy with Bill 1. In their reinvention of the public-private partnership, the insurance companies are going to be very happy with Bill 1 because it does exactly what they want along the lines that I've outlined. And despite the fact that the leader of my party, who is a lawyer, and I, who am a lawyer, have criticized it, and the honourable member for Halifax Fairview, who is also a lawyer, has criticized it, the true fact, Mr. Speaker, is that every lawyer in the province who practices in this area of the law is going to be thrilled with the complexities that Bill 1 offers to them in terms of potential litigation. They probably don't like the idea of the caps, but the whole focus in the courts is going to shift to that definition of minor injury. We're not yet at clause-by-clause debate, but we know that there is sufficient ambiguity in that clause to keep the lawyers and courts in this province busy for years. And I don't think that that is exactly what it is that the public in Nova Scotia had in mind when they began to complain about the skyrocketing cost of their insurance rates. If the core problem is that the insurance companies are simply paying too much, or if they think that claims are fraudulent, as was said by the member from Halifax Fairview, let them take a hard line on fraud, let them do something about it. Let them investigate it, let them litigate, let them, in concert, all of the companies, say that it won't be tolerated. But Bill 1 is not the solution for that. Bill 1 prefers the profits of the companies over the livelihoods, over the pocketbooks, over the pocketbook concerns of all Nova Scotians.
Shame on Rob.
And those profits
Shame on Rob.
are ones which they're probably going to be able to continue to increase because of the return on their investments in the stock markets. Their rate of return on equity is going up. And there is a lot of room, as I read Bill 1, for the companies to continue to argue for a rate of return that will cause problems, continue to cause problems for their customers in Nova Scotia. Their preferred return on equity is 10%. Well, you know what? It's nice of them to have a preference for it. Unfortunately, the Utility and Review Board in Nova Scotia seems to agree with them that as soon as a business is regulated by the province, there should be an automatic entitlement to a generous return on equity. They do it with Nova Scotia Power, and they do it with the automobile insurance companies. But you know what? Most Nova Scotians have quite a different view of what's fair. Most Nova Scotians don't get that kind of return guaranteed to them on their activities. It's not part of the minimum wage system. It's not part of the community services system. It's not part of other investments in the stock market or the bond market. It's not part of salary increases, whether unionized or non-unionized. The reality for most Nova Scotians is that they don't get that kind of return on equity in their day-to-day lives or in their business activities. And there are many businesses out there that are regulated, although not by the Utility and Review Board or by this new Insurance Review Board. Lots of businesses are regulated. Restaurants are regulated. There are environmental rules, there are health rules. Paint stores are regulated. Barbers are regulated. Everyone who has a business is regulated in some way. Are they in a position to argue for a guaranteed 10% return on equity? I don't think so. Why these companies? And what's the government doing about that? Nothing in Bill 1. So, in the end, what we have here is a proposal that in no way solves the problem. The government has misconstrued the problem as it's experienced by Nova Scotians from one end of this province to the other. They have hitched their fortunes to the star of the insurance companies, and they've done it conjointly with the third party. That's the triple P that I was put in mind of at the beginning. Public-private partnerships. It was a bad idea when the Liberals did it, when they were a majority government, and it's a bad idea when it now creeps forward into public life in this guise.
Liberals, Tories, and
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, the Insurance Act we see before us is a long time coming. Almost 2 years ago, our Liberal caucus called on all parties in this legislature to come together to work on a strategy to address the issue of rising auto insurance rates. Since that time, when we first recognized auto insurance as a problem in Nova Scotia, many things have happened. The government wandered aimlessly through the issue of promising action, but delivering only a freeze. During this time, Mr. Speaker, the Liberal caucus was at work gathering information, talking to interest groups and consumers alike. The result was an insurance policy which I am proud to say was the first solution offered to Nova Scotians. And I'm also proud to say that it is the only policy which has not changed from the time it was announced to today. The Conservatives, Mr. Speaker, were using the same time not to develop an insurance policy which could provide relief for Nova Scotian consumers. Instead, they were developing a political agenda, including $155 payoffs and an embarrassing pre-election spending spree. The election, Mr. Speaker, saw the Conservatives adopt a made in New Brunswick solution, which has proven not to be workable. They promised Nova Scotians relief in the form of a 20% average rate reduction. When the Tories were asked how these savings would be realized, they described them as a cap on minor associated injuries, such as aches and sprains. Mr. Speaker, if anybody is going to make this minority government work, if anybody is going to make this legislation work for Nova Scotia, it's going to be the Liberal Party. The NDP party ran on a better deal for the working families, is now all too quick to delay relief by over 6 months for those who claim that they support. Let me say in no uncertain terms that Liberal support for this bill is by no means a foregone conclusion. There are substantial amendments that must be made before this legislation will truly benefit Nova Scotians and win Liberal support. Certainly one of the most important amendments that must be made to this legislation is the seriously flawed definition of a minor injury. Let me paint a picture for you which describes what the Tories would have you believe is a minor injury. You could be knocked into a coma, suffer a broken leg, and miss substantial work, and as a result of a car accident, say. Wake up relatively healed. Under this scenario, as ridiculous as it seems, Mr. Speaker, you would have no income recovery. You would have no income recovery because the government has sacrificed that coverage and replaced it with a $2,500 cap. Even if your injury is considered severe and you are eligible for income recovery, the insurance company will keep your Canada pension contributions, your EI contributions, and your income tax deductions. What does this mean? It means more money in the pockets of the insurance companies and less money in the pockets of Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, now that the Tories have not only changed the types of injuries that are considered minor, they have changed the types of coverage that will be sacrificed. This is just another example of the Tories trying to pull the wool over the Nova Scotian, the eyes of the Nova Scotians with a cheap bribe. The government is offering another bribe of $160 on an average.
Sit down, John.
Okay.
The comments that the honourable member is making are unparliamentary. I'd ask you to retract that, please, and the honourable member for Victoria Lakes has the floor.
Were bribed.
Thank you, sir.
And well,
Victoria
we'll
Lakes.
retract it twice then.
The honourable member
And
for
we'll
Victoria
say
Lakes has the floor.
$160 promise and $160 promise, two repetitions for the two words that we withdraw. In the same vein of the $155 checks, Mr. Speaker, this government is willing to sell the souls of Nova Scotia's insurance system by dangling an average $150 saving or a carrot in front of Nova Scotians.
You got it. It's a carrot. It's an expensive carrot, too.
The definition we see in this bill is not what the government campaigned on in July and August. During the election, the Premier spoke of a cap on minor injuries. When I think of a minor injury, I think of a sore arm, a wrenched back, a sprained foot. These are all injuries which are painful but not life-altering. Why the Premier is determined to take us down the exact same failed road as New Brunswick is beyond me. Secondly, the definition put forward in New Brunswick and copied in Nova Scotia is extremely broad and would cap the vast majority of injury claims, including some permanent injuries. As well, this cap, Mr. Speaker, will also see people who suffer a serious but non-permanent injury capped at $2,500. This bill is not what we want, but we have to support it presently to get it in second reading, to get it to law amendments in order where we can put forward our amendments and have input from the public to get the best for Nova Scotians. With a government that is letting the municipality of HRM and Mayor Kelly, and I must compliment Mayor Kelly and HRM for taking the lead. In fact, I'd like to refer to Mayor Kelly as the Rudy Giuliano of Nova Scotia in this instance. and in particular, he's taking the lead with this hurricane disaster, I shudder at the thoughts of what the cost of a government-run system would be. This bill, Mr. Speaker, is gutting the compensation system in Nova Scotia. When it is possible for someone to be in a car accident, knocked into a coma, broken arms, or severe injuries, and yet it's classed as a minor injury, we have a serious problem. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians pay for insurance so that when they are injured in a car accident, they can be reasonably compensated for their injury. The bill does not do that. Instead, this bill all it does is reward the insurance companies for raising their premiums. Unfortunately, the only people enjoying a benefit from our investment in insurance is the insurance companies. Mr. Speaker, this is truly shocking. For this government to think it is fair to claw back from injured Nova Scotians the long-term disability coverage they have paid into and to turn around and give it to an insurance company is unbelievable. Well, maybe it's not. Mr. Speaker, this is the same government that canceled the pension at age 18 for Down syndrome residents without notice and moved it to age 19. So maybe I shouldn't be shocked. At the same time, this is the same government that gave out $70 million in $155 checks, and they're now $32 million in the hole. Mr. Speaker, there's a theme to this bill from one end to the other. The payouts for so-called minor injuries are going to put millions of dollars into the pockets of the insurance. Let me refer to why we prefer private insurance over government insurance. There's a myth out there that government insurance operates more effectively, that it's cheaper. The administrative expense ratios for Saskatchewan government insurance, Manitoba public insurance, and the Insurance Corporation of British Columbia versus the private insurance are significantly misrepresented. The government-run programs, they include commissions and taxes, but they exclude other general expenses. In contrast, when the private auto insurance industry quotes operating expenses, it includes all expenses, Mr. Speaker. In summary, the private insurance industry's expense numbers compare favorably to government-run insurances. When they are higher, they can almost be explained by the fact that government-run insurance enjoys tax status as crown corporations. Secondly, they have the accounting ability to move certain items out of expenses into claims. And if we're talking publicly owned insurance, we already have an option. Publicly owned insurance, buy co-op insurance. That's publicly owned. During my campaign, Mr. Speaker, I contacted 2 actuarial insurance investigators to give me guidance, one from Nova Scotia and one from Ontario. And this is why I'm so committed to the insurance that we have presently. In true Tory fashion, Mr. Speaker, we see some of our most vulnerable citizens targeted in this legislation. For the people that are most affected by this little gem of a bill, seniors, family members who sacrifice their own careers to stay at home and care for a loved one. As a member of a very large family, Mr. Speaker, I remember my parents saying when I was just a kid, Tory times are hard times. Nothing has changed. The people who stay home to care for their family members, according to this government, they have no value, so therefore they should not be compensated for their work. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians work hard, and they're a hard-working people. They take pride in their work, and they go the extra mile to get the job done right. Examples of this have been brought forward here in this very House and cited because of the effects of Hurricane Juan. People have stepped up to the plate and taken on the challenge to help their neighbor. Because of this well-recognized work ethic, Mr. Speaker, many Nova Scotians have accumulated or banked a fair number of sick days. These are days that the employee pays for. They've invested their time and money so that if they need them, these days will be there. What this government sees when it looks at our sick days, Mr. Speaker, is not a reflection of a hard-working society, but they see an opportunity to put money back into the pockets of the insurance industry. This bill, Mr. Speaker, will also see the injured Nova Scotian have to exhaust their sick day reserve before they will see any money from an insurance company. Not unlike our seniors today, an injured Nova Scotian is going to have to exhaust this time they have invested before this government thinks it is fair for an insurance company to have to compensate the injured worker. Mr. Speaker, again, we see this government literally taking money out of the pocket of the injured Nova Scotian and putting it into the pocket of the insurance company. In the last election, the Liberal Party put forward a plan that, in a true spirit of liberalism, struck a balance between protecting the rights of injury victims and guaranteeing relief for consumers from rapidly increasing insurance rates. We made a promise to Nova Scotians to limit our cap to the pain and suffering component of soft tissue injuries. Mr. Speaker, it is interesting to note that the Conservatives during their last election also promised a cap on only minor injuries. I wonder how many Nova Scotians believed on August the 5th that 2 broken legs and 6 months in a coma would be considered a minor injury. Mr. Speaker, this government has sold Nova Scotians out to the insurance companies. They have proposed in this bill to take deserved compensation out of the pockets of Nova Scotians and to put it into the hands of the insurance company. This is not fair, Mr. Speaker, and it is a fundamental flaw in this legislation. The Liberal Party stands on the side of accident victims, which is why, as our leader indicated in his address on second reading, that unless the government makes significant changes to parts of this bill, our caucus will not be able to support it. We cannot allow injury victims to be victimized again in this government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to be able to get up and speak a bit about this bill, Bill number 1, the first bill to be debated in the new session after an election. And let's be honest, Mr. Speaker, I think all of us, to some extent or another, in the last election, in that 28, 30-day period that we were involved in it, actually heard a lot about insurance. And I've been listening to the different debates, and particularly, obviously, from members from this side of the House opposition, members from the third party, members from our party. I haven't heard much from the Tory caucus yet. I would hope that maybe they would take the chance to get up, Mr. Speaker, because this is an opportunity for them to put on the record what they heard from their constituents. Because presumably, from this bill, we can presume that the government has talked to their constituents, that the constituents have expressed to them the desire that this type of legislation come forward. I must say that's a very different opinion than I received when I was on the doorstep, because the Nova Scotians I spoke to, the people in my riding of Cole Harbour Eastern Passage, had a very different perspective. They wanted lower rates, Mr. Speaker. They wanted lower rates that could be guaranteed and that could be based on legitimate form of insurance. And quite frankly, this bill doesn't provide that. This bill is, quite frankly, trying to tinker with a free market system that we have in this province. We have a free market system of insurance. If I want insurance for my vehicle, of course it's mandatory, according to the Motor Vehicle Act. To drive a car, I need insurance. Mr. Speaker, then I go to the marketplace, and there are private companies that will provide me with insurance. That system had, in the past, worked well for our province, but I would suggest to you the system is broken, that it has failed, and that the rates now are not good enough. They are too high, and many Nova Scotians are unable to afford insurance. We see that in the rates in which the number of people who are being charged with driving without insurance has increased. Most of them are telling us they can't afford the insurance. So it's important for them to go out and actually drive. Now, we all know that's not legal, and that's not right, and of course that isn't appropriate. But there are other means of trying to ensure that people can drive while ensuring that they have automobile insurance so that them and others, if they get in an accident, are protected. That's really what this system is about. Don't drive a vehicle unless you have a pool of money for which, if you get in an accident, that money can be drawn upon to ensure that people are going to be protected, whether you hit a pedestrian in a crosswalk, or whether you bump into someone else's car, or whether they bump into you, Mr. Speaker. There needs to be a pool of money through insurance to ensure that that money is going to be there to protect people and ensure that they are going to be able to be provided for Because in some cases it's very serious. It's death, obviously, but people can be paralyzed. People could have a closed head injury that could result, Mr. Speaker, in them spending the rest of their lives never being able to work again. And some of the cases you hear about, obviously, are very compassionate. But the fact is that, some of the most classic examples I recall from days of studying are those in which someone may be 20 or 22 years old, and maybe a little older, in their 20s, and they just finished their university degree, or maybe they just finished medical school, or maybe they just finished law school, and they have great potential to become someone who's going to earn a lot of money in their life. And they're struck by a car, or they are in a car accident, and there has to be some determination through the Insurance Act. That's what we provide, rules and regulations as to how we determine what those policies will provide for, so that those workers are provided with, those people are provided with an income. And that income should be based on future loss, future potential loss in many cases. It's not so hard when they're 50 and you already know what their career is, or if they're younger maybe. But Mr. Speaker, the fact is that we have a very complicated system in this province, a complicated system of how we determine through the courts how much someone will be paid if they're injured and they're not able to go back to work, whether that's for a day, a week, a month, or for the rest of their life. And that system, as I said, had worked well. The problem is it hasn't been working, not that people haven't been compensated if they're injured, not that people aren't getting the money they deserve if someone else hits them with a vehicle and they're in a car or they're a pedestrian. That part hasn't broken down. What has broken down, Mr. Speaker, is the cost that is prohibitive to so many Nova Scotians that prevents them from being able to afford the insurance. And in a province like ours, a car is not only a privilege, it's invaluable. And in many parts of this province, outside of Halifax and maybe parts of CBRM, Mr. Speaker, there is no choice. The concept of having public transit to be able to transport you around as a means of going for groceries or going to the store to buy clothing, Mr. Speaker, it's just not practical. It's not there. And so a car is a necessity. And because of that, we make insurance necessity. A car becomes a necessity in rural Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, to most Nova Scotians. Therefore, we must ensure that we have affordable insurance. This government, Mr. Speaker, has taken the position that affordable insurance comes from sticking a monkey wrench in the free market system. This bill basically tells the insurance companies, and I suspect they were aware that this was coming. I suspect there were consultations with the insurance industry, that this isn't coming out of the blue to them, Mr. Speaker. Considering the same day this bill came out, the Insurance Bureau of Canada had full-page ads in the local newspaper saying how they thought this was a wonderful idea. So I don't think I'm too far off in suggesting there might have been some consultations between the government and the Insurance Bureau of Canada before this bill ever hit the desks of the members in this House, Mr. Speaker. But because of this, Mr. Speaker, as I say, there's a monkey wrench has been driven into the free market system. And this has already been tried in New Brunswick a few months ago, and we're beginning to already see the problems that have been caused by this approach. And I find it quite ironic that a party like the Progressive Conservative Party, that for so many is equated with a party of the free market, a party of a form of neoliberalism in which we ensure that business should be able, we should get off the backs of business. I remember a few years ago when this party got reelected to government, Mr. Speaker, in 1999, they created a red tape committee because they wanted to make sure that we were going to reduce the red tape for business so that they were able to, business could get on with the job of creating jobs and government will do the job of minimizing the amount of regulation that would be required. We didn't hear much of it after a while. I think the backbenchers that were involved sort of petered out and decided to do something else, Mr. Speaker. But the fact is that this government has a history, or this party that is the government, Mr. Speaker, has a history of presenting itself as the party supporting the free market system, supporting a system that ensures that business should be able to be minimally regulated, and in return, they will ensure that most of the money that they spend will be in creating jobs and putting it back into the economy. Sort of the free hand of capitalism, Mr. Speaker. That is what the Progressive Conservative Party has generally stood for over the years. That's what this government, I think, has generally run itself on. Yet, what do we see in this legislation? We see massive regulation. We see complicated rules imposed on businesses as some form of way of manipulating or twisting the free market system as a means of trying to argue we can reduce rates. Because quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, this government, I think, knew when this issue became a clear and present problem for them in January of 2002, almost 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker, when people started really getting their rates, their new renewal rates, Mr. Speaker, people started realizing the cost. And then the government said, well, we have a problem because the free market isn't working. These private insurance companies aren't able to provide this at a rate in which most Nova Scotians can afford it. It's going sky high. This is a problem. What are we going to do? Well, there were a few options. Our party decided to take one of those options, Mr. Speaker, and say the free market system isn't working. And you know what? In most cases, we wouldn't say that. Our party believes that in most cases, the free market system works just fine. There's a few problems with regard to auto insurance, though, Mr. Speaker. Unlike most products where you have the automatic choice of deciding whether you want to buy this or buy that, or whether you want to buy the product at all, do you want to buy guns or butter, I guess, as most economists would say, or do you want to buy butter or margarine, different types of the same product, Mr. Speaker? With regard to auto insurance, consumers have no choice. They have to buy it if they want a car. And as I said earlier, a car is a necessity in this province, and therefore, quite frankly, most people in Nova Scotia have no choice. They have to buy insurance. And in the free market system, well, really, it isn't a free market system if they're forced to buy it. We have a problem where those people are not able to get affordable insurance. So, given the fact that the government mandates that Nova Scotians must have auto insurance, it creates a very unique situation for this type of product, this type of insurance, Mr. Speaker. It creates a situation where the private companies know you're going to have to buy it. They know you're going to have to do that, and amongst a smallish sort of group of members, they're able to ensure the rates can go up so that everyone basically will have to pay more. There are a few exceptions. I've met a few people on the doorstep who are involved in federal government or retired from the federal government, some in the military who deal with a group in Ontario called Personal Insurance. I think it's a group insurance company. And most of them talk about the fact that the rates are very, very low. I have a lot of members in my riding who are in the military, Mr. Speaker. And when I would talk to them, they would say, look, insurance isn't a problem for me because they would say, I have personal insurance. I have the personal insurance group from Ontario, and the rates are very, very good. And I don't mind putting that on the record for anyone out there involved in the federal civil service or retired from it. They may want to check into that because my understanding is the rates are very good for them. And they generally find that they don't have a problem with the rates. For whatever reason, that company hasn't been involved in whatever discussions have been held amongst other companies, Mr. Speaker. But the fact is, with those couple of exceptions, we have a situation in which the government mandates that insurance must be bought, must be purchased. So it's no longer just a free market. I have no choice. I must buy the product because I need to have a car, as most Nova Scotians would say. So therefore, the free market doesn't really exist with regard to auto insurance. And then on top of that, Mr. Speaker, the government decides, okay, but clearly the rates are too high. These companies are charging too much. So what are we going to do? We have to roll back the rates. So they bring in a very complicated piece of legislation with very complicated rules that result, Mr. Speaker, in trying to roll back the rates 20%. Now, I'll tell you what I heard most from people during the election about rolling back rates, and I thought this was the most telling, because most Nova Scotians aren't fooled by this. The first thing they would say was, yeah, they'll roll back rates 20%, but they went up 65% last year, they went up 65% the year before. And now you're going to roll them back 20%? Well, quite frankly, as far as their math is concerned, the insurance companies are the winners. They've raised rates 100, 150% in the last 2 years, and in return, they have to roll them back 20%. Well, overall, the insurance companies have done pretty well, given that kind of math, Mr. Speaker. But this government has decided that it's important that they show they're doing something, that the free market system can work with a lot of regulation, with a lot of forcing and twisting arms to ensure the insurance industry rolls its rates back. Now, the problem is in New Brunswick, they said this, and in fact, a lot of companies have not rolled back their rates. They have not decided to roll them back. They're supposed to, I know the system that well in New Brunswick, but I believe they all have to apply within a certain period of time. There's a deadline. They're supposed to submit it to a board, and they're supposed to say how they're going to roll back the rates, and the board has to approve them or say, no, that's not good enough. Well, Mr. Speaker, I believe a lot of them haven't done that. There's still a lot of problems with that system. And we're going to see those same problems with this system, Mr. Speaker. And I'll talk a bit more in the detail about exactly where some of those hidden problems are. And I suspect a lot of this was actually written by the insurance industry. I'm just going to say that on the record. I suspect the insurance industry's hand is all over this bill, Mr. Speaker, all over it. Because quite frankly, there's a few little areas where the language is so slippery that it had to be written by lawyers for insurance companies, Mr. Speaker. I can see no other way that some of this language should have gotten in here unless the insurance industry had was holding the hand of the government lawyer as it was written. But quite frankly, we're in a situation where this government has decided they have to defend the free market for some reason, And because of that, they believe that in this case, that means they're going to roll back rates 20%, and through it, they're going to create a lot of regulation, a lot of complication, and as I said earlier, they're throwing a monkey wrench into the free market system of how we provide insurance in this province. Our position was quite different. We saw a problem and said there are solutions that have worked in other provinces. It has worked in British Columbia, it has worked in Saskatchewan, it has worked in Manitoba, and Quebec is a bit of an anomaly with regard to this. It's a hybrid system, but it's worked there as well. And Mr. Speaker, as a result, they have lower rates. Yes, some of them are no fault. Yes, some of them are tort system. But the fact is the rates are generally lower, Mr. Speaker, and as a result, we said, here's a system that's working. It isn't the free market. We understand that. In most cases, we believe the free market can work and we should allow it to work. But as I said earlier, let's be honest, this really isn't a free market system anyway because it's mandatory that we purchase this insurance. So why don't we treat it differently? And all we're saying is let's talk about a mutual. And I talked to some people in insurance, and they call them mutuals, I guess. They're basically cooperatives. A bunch of people get together, pool their money together, and as a result, they have a pool of money that is used to pay off any damages that are created by the accidents. All we're saying is let's create one big mutual for Nova Scotia. One big mutual that will ensure we have a pool of money that stays in Nova Scotia to address damages and accidents in Nova Scotia by Nova Scotian drivers. That's all we're talking about. It's worked in other provinces and it can work here. Now we hear the words from members of the different parties who, try and label what we're saying as, anti-business or socialist or whatever. But the fact is, it has worked. And the irony is, Mr. Speaker, that when it has been brought into other provinces, when it was brought into Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and BC by the NDP, when it was brought into Quebec by, I presume, the Parti Québécois, but I'm not absolutely sure of that, when the other parties come into power, Mr. Speaker, they haven't removed it. They haven't gotten rid of it. Isn't that interesting? They decided once it was there that it was working, and therefore they're not going to go back and revoke the system. It was even a promise, I believe, in the last provincial election in British Columbia by the now governing Liberal Party that they would sell the insurance system. They would break it up. But when they got into power, they realized that they're not going to do it because it is working too well. I'm not saying it's perfect. We all know insurance systems aren't perfect. People are always going to be unhappy with the decision as to whether they get paid or not paid. Mr. Speaker, whether they got enough money for their injuries or not. But the fact is, the system generally works. It generally works because, much like in the healthcare system in Canada versus the United States, we have one system funded by the government that ensures that we get rid of all that administrative clutter, all that bureaucracy that's created when you have 2, 20, 200, 2,000 companies providing it. In the United States, I believe, as a percentage of their gross domestic product, they pay 14% of their gross domestic product on healthcare. And yet, 15% of Americans don't even have healthcare insurance. That's because they pay so much in administrative costs, because they have so many insurance companies all duplicating their jobs and resulting in a lot of administrative cost on top of the actual cost of the system. Now, quite frankly, in Canada, because we have one system for healthcare, we're able to provide ours at about 8% of our gross domestic product, which is almost half of what it is in the United States. So already we can prove that in a system that, quite frankly, should not be considered and should not be provided by the free market. We all agree in Canada, I think now, or at least most sane-minded people would agree, that we're better off with not having our health care insurance provided through a free market system. Because of that, we're better off. We're a healthier society, we live longer, everyone has access to health care, Mr. Speaker. But with auto insurance, some have decided, that's not the way to go. And instead, they believe we can fix the old system. And you see, the more I think about it as I'm on my feet, the more I compare it to the United States and how they're trying to deal with health care. The concept of going to a universal system funded by the government probably would have solved all these problems years ago and would have dropped the amount of money being wasted in the system on administration. But instead, you see them tinkering with it. More regulation, more rules, more details, more twisting, more bending to try and ensure that for whatever it takes, we'll prove that the free market can work, and another problem crops up. Another difficulty happens, and they have to go back and fix that as well, Mr. Speaker. This is the problem with what this government is doing. And so many times our party's accused of being the ideological ones, Mr. Speaker. The irony is, in this case, the Progressive Conservative Party is the one that is standing and digging its feet in based on ideology. Because instead of looking with a clear eye as to what the best system is for Nova Scotians, what has worked in other provinces, best practices, so to speak, they're deciding that they're going to twist and manipulate and overregulate in order to ensure that come hell or high water, they're going to make sure that system, Mr. Speaker, is working for them. Now, Mr. Speaker, based on that, and I said earlier, I think I see the hand of the insurance industry as they held the hand of the government writing this bill, but I want to talk about a couple of specific points. First of all, the definition of minor injury, because this is crucial. As I was saying to someone earlier, this isn't capping benefits, Mr. Speaker, this is kneecapping benefits, because what we have with this bill is a wide open ability for the insurance companies to say, you have a minor injury, $2,500 maximum. I'll give an example. If someone is, as I said, 22, 23 years old, was injured, maybe started up a new business or just started a job, Mr. Speaker, and they have an injury that is quite serious, a coma, 2 broken legs. Maybe they're going to be off work for 6 months, a year, but they will get better. They will recover, and they will recover to be healthy. And they're not going to have any lasting effects for the rest of their lives, or at least nothing that's very serious. They can't stop them from working. Well, Mr. Speaker, under this legislation, that's a minor injury. You could be off work for 1 year. You could be off work for 2 years. But if the prognosis is you will eventually get back to work, that is a minor injury. You get $2,500 for pain and suffering and for any non-economic losses. Well, what does that mean? Obviously, if, because of it, your car is damaged or other things, and obviously you're going to be reimbursed for that separately. But one of those non-economic losses, Mr. Speaker, is actually the job that you're going to lose. You had a certain guarantee of a job at a certain income, and yet you're not going to be compensated necessarily for that, given the nature of what this bill says. Minor injury, as it's defined, allows the insurance company to dictate and to drive a truck through the ability of people in Nova Scotia to get a fair rate of recovery, a fair rate of compensation for their injuries. And that's one of the things I believe was directly written by the insurance company. I suspect, and I'll say this on the record, that back in the spring, before we even had the election, before we had the first freeze that came in, there were discussions between the insurance industry and someone in the government to ensure that if you're going to put in this kind of bill, you better make sure that the definition of minor injury is so broad that we're able to we'll give you your 20% cut, they probably said. We can give it to you. But you've got to have a definition of minor injury that's so broad that we're able to drive a truck through it, and we're able to ensure that most of those people in Nova Scotia that deserve more than $2,500 are going to get nothing. And many Nova Scotians are going to suffer because of this, Mr. Speaker. They're going to suffer badly. And you know what? Those people live in Lockport. Those people live in Bible Hill. Those people live in Mabou. Those are the people that are going to call up in 6 months' time, and they're going to say to the member from Inverness, the member from Truro Bible Hill, the member from Shelburne, they're going to say to them, wait a minute now, I was in a motor vehicle accident, and, I broke my leg. I broke both my legs. And I'm being told I'm getting $2,500 in compensation over and above any damages. But I've lost my job, and I have nothing to go back to. What's happening here? I thought you told me that I was going to be able to get all the benefits I wanted. This was about whiplash. This was about those malingerers who were trying to rip off the system. Well, I'm not ripping off the system, yet I am not getting what I deserve. What I honestly deserve because I am hurt. They're telling me this is a minor injury, when in fact it's a serious injury. I broke both my legs. Yeah, but the fact is, well, I'm not going to say what the fact is. The fact is the member from Inverness, the member from Truro Bible Hill, the member from Shelburne, and others are going to have to explain to them why this bill is ruining their lives. Didn't fix the problem. Will rates go down? Maybe for a little while. There'll be a board appointed. In a couple of years, they'll be co-opted by the IBC, and eventually the rates will keep going up. We see that in Ontario. We see it in Alberta. It's only a matter of time. Let's face it, the system, again, maybe we'll come back and put more regulation on, and we'll twist it some more. The whole system will look like a horribly mutated pretzel, Mr. Speaker. But the fact is that Nova Scotians are not, in the long run, going to benefit from this. There'll be some malingerers that in the end won't go out, probably, and seek compensation for whiplash. But my colleague from Halifax-Chebucto put it very well. And I said this to people when I was on the doorstep, and they would say, well, there's some people who try and get more out of the system than they deserve. And I say, you're right. You know what? It doesn't matter the system. EI, workers' comp, insurance, they all try and do it. It's a given study. 5-6% of the people always try and get more out of the system than they should. But, Mr. Speaker, the problem is, with regard to that, this government is taking the wrong approach or trying to deal with it. Taking the wrong approach. And I think what the member from Halifax-Buckto was saying is appropriate, that the insurance companies have to be diligent in challenging those that they think are malingerers or trying to get more out of the system. You know what? If one Nova Scotian, if one very well-publicized case of a Nova Scotian went to court and the insurance industry challenged them and was able to say, you know what, you actually don't have whiplash, we're going to challenge you, there'd be a heck of a lot more people in this province who would say, whoa, I'm not going to do that. I don't get my easy money. You know, some people call it the auto lottery or other things. They say, look, I get easy money from this. Well, Mr. Speaker, the fact is they get easy money because the insurance companies look at the bottom line. Well, I can go to court for each case and it will cost us $40,000 in legal fees, or we can just cut a check for $10,000 now and get it over with. Well, golly, given that system, who wouldn't try and get the money, Mr. Speaker? The fact is that if the insurance companies actually did their job and actually challenged people who they think aren't actually eligible for the benefits they're claiming, we'd probably have a lot less. So instead, let's be clear, instead of the insurance industry actually doing its job, it wants the government to regulate it so that it doesn't have to pay out what it should be paying out, or what it doesn't have to pay out. And that's a problem. And that's why the system's broken. And that's why this government, instead of seeing with clear vision what needs to be done, has decided to create a very convoluted, regulated system that's only going to result in more problems 6 months from now. I'll put it on the record now. In 6 months, in a year, in 2 years, we'll look back and say, we told you so. Because this system will not work. I can tell you right now. And part of it is the definition of minor injury. Until that is changed, most Nova Scotians are going to feel the ill effects of this legislation. The insurance companies are probably laughing all the way to their little bank and with their big amounts of money, where they're able to say, as long as we have that definition of minor injury, we win. We'll roll back 20% now. Don't worry, we'll co-opt the board. Eventually, we'll get that money back and lots more. But in the meantime, by having that minor injury definition, this will all go away. They've got some PR flack probably telling them, this is how you got to get rid of the problem. They've probably been telling them that since January 2002. Wouldn't be surprised if the IBC actually showed up at the doorstep in the government and said, here's our proposal. Instead of public insurance, we don't want that. We'll cut 20%, promise you, if you put this definition in. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's not the way the system works. And the people who haven't been involved, the people who haven't helped write this legislation, are the people of Nova Scotia who in the end are going to suffer because of it. And there are definitions out there. If this is about whiplash, if this is about soft tissue injuries that are hard to define, let's define it that way. But the way they define minor injury allows the insurance companies to drive a truck through it, Mr. Speaker, and that's not good for Nova Scotians. There's another thing here that I think is interesting. It's going to save the insurance industry a lot of money, and it's funny because it's in the numbers, and the Minister of Finance, being an accountant, might very well find this interesting, is that when you decide how much someone gets, again, if they're 22 years old and they just got out of school, and it's determined that they should be paid until they turn 65, X amount of money for the job they would have had as a lawyer or a doctor because they were in medical school or law school. Well, Mr. Speaker, they don't give them that each year, so that's not 50 years times by $50,000. What they do is they discount it, assuming that that money will go into a bank account, accumulate interest, and after 50 years would amount to that amount. So based on that, they're able to reduce things on a certain percentage, based on what a bond yield would be. Given a pool of money today, 50 years from now, this is how much money you would have accumulated. It would be equal to that. So, you know, we don't want you to make more than you need. Fair enough. So we'll give you a smaller amount of money now. You invest it at a certain bond rate over and above the inflation rate, and we'll end up ensuring that you're going to get as much money as you ever did. It doesn't always work that way. A lot of people go out and spend some of it, obviously, because they have certain needs. But, Mr. Speaker, at the same time, you have a situation where in Nova Scotia, in the civil procedure rules, there's a set rate, 2.5%. So above inflation, if inflation is 2.5%, then the presumption is a bond rate will be 5%, 2.5% above. Inflation is 3%, it's a 2.5% rate, which would make 5.5%. But that's a given. It's written in the rules, 2.5%. Well, Mr. Speaker, this legislation sets it at 3.25%. Now, that sounds like a minor difference. But over 30, 40, 50 years, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about a massive amount of money. A massive amount of, so that means that instead of having to pay out $100,000 now, that would accumulate to maybe $1 million in 50 years. I'm just pulling numbers out, Mr. Speaker. They only have to pay them $70,000 or $80,000 now. That will accumulate based on this higher rate of 3.25%. So what's that mean? Well, Mr. Speaker, that means the insurance company have to pay out less. More money coming in rates over the last 2 years, even with this 20% discount, less money going out. Geez, that's pretty good for the insurance companies, Mr. Speaker. No wonder they're so happy to come here and help the government write the legislation, because it's quite clear that they're making money off of it. The rates have gone up 150%. We'll drop them down 20%, but we'll, on the other side, be able to cap serious injuries at $2,500. Now, they might be called minor injuries, but let's face it, they're really serious injuries. Broken legs, coma, whatever. As long as you're going to get better someday, we'll be able to give you a tiny bit of money. And on top of that, Mr. Speaker, we'll have to pay out less. Because if you're injured, seriously injured, even if you're able to beat us on that minor injury definition, and you have a serious injury and we're going to have to pay out a lot of money, we'll really only have to pay out about 70, 80% of that, because we'll just put in this number that's actually higher than the rest of the people in the courts get, so that we're able to actually save money there. Not a bad deal. Another reason why I believe the insurance company's hand is all over this, like a Ouija board, Mr. Speaker. Another part of this I find interesting, it's called Section B or Schedule B of the Insurance Act, and these are provisions for what you get if you're injured. These are the amount of money you're paid for loss of time at work. And in Nova Scotia, it's actually, I think it's the worst in Canada. I think it's $140 a week or something. Don't quote me on that, but, well, you are going to quote me on that. But I mean, the rate is quite low compared to other provinces. $140 a week or something like that, Mr. Speaker. It's low compared to the other provinces. It hasn't gone up. And of course, given the minor injury definition, it's probably going to be less anyway. But this is what the government is doing. Instead of making that mandatory, which I believe it is now, that you have to pay in for your Schedule B benefits, so that if you're injured, you end up having to get paid compensation for loss of time at work, they're now making it an option. You can check a box for an extra few $100. You can get it from your insurance company. So the insurance company, for what they're providing for you now, minus 20%, given these presumable rate reductions, they're going to give you less. And if you want that extra service, it's going to be a few $100s more. So it sounds to me, most Nova Scotians will want it. If you're in a decent job, or you have a job with a decent income, or you've got children, you're going to say, you know what, I need that. Because I need to guarantee that I'm going to get a decent income if I'm injured. May not happen, but I got to get, that's what insurance is. I need that guarantee, so I'm going to check that box. Well, I said to someone today, it's like McDonald's. Do you want fries with that? This is all upsales. It's all about the insurance industry able to say, well, I'm giving you the basics here at 20% less than you're paying before, but if you want the extras, you're going to have to pay more for it. So what used to be part of the original rate, and now that's been reduced 20%, doesn't include a major component which I'm going to have to pay extra for. In the end, I'm going to pay as much as I did before, as get the same service. And the insurance company makes as much money, yet they're paying out less through minor injury definition and through this discount rate. Well, Mr. Speaker, again, another sign to me that the insurance industry's hand is all over this legislation. And it's really important, I think, Mr. Speaker, that we have one rate. We don't need a two-tier system with regard to these rates. If the insurance industry cannot provide basic income loss at a reasonable rate to Nova Scotians, then the system is broken. And no amount of regulation is going to fix that. No amount of tinkering with it, no amount of slicing pieces off that are important to the system are going to fix it, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, the problem is this government still, because of its myopic ideology, believes the free market must do this. We must have the free market continue to provide it, and therefore we must ensure that Nova Scotians get a cheaper rate, even if we have to cut pieces off of it. It's like amputating a leg to save the body. Well, Mr. Speaker, you cut too much off and the body's not left anymore. And that seems to be what's happening with regard to this legislation and this government with regard to auto insurance. You know, one of the other things I think this legislation could do, particularly, I thought it was interesting yesterday, the minister in charge of skyrocketing insurance rates, and I'm not going to say auto insurance because it's all insurance now. And after Hurricane 1, let's be clear, it's going to be a lot higher house insurance rates, tenant insurance, liability insurance. We already heard through the summer these businesses, these ecotourism businesses that weren't able to operate because they couldn't get insurance. Insurance industry already didn't want to provide benefits to them, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, the problem is that it's only going to get worse with regard to home insurance. It's only going to get worse with regard to tenant insurance. Hurricane 1 is just the next step. We already knew that it was going to be bad given everything else that was happening. You already began to hear it in the summer. I know personally my office at liability insurance, my insurance that cover my office, doubled in the last year, and I have an office the size of that clerk's table, quite frankly. But the fact is that it's only going to get worse. It's only going to get worse. And Nova Scotians are beginning to, and I heard that on the doorstep this summer too. Maybe the member from Inverness, maybe the member from Kings North heard that as well. But they are starting, wait a minute now, I think house insurance is the next thing, and we got to be prepared to deal with it. Well, wouldn't it, and the Minister of Insurance yesterday said, this new insurance review board will deal with that as well. I didn't check Hansard, but I'm pretty sure that's what he said. Well, Mr. Speaker, if that's the case, why don't we have something in the legislation to ensure that they are going to look at that? Let's talk about the review board doing a review. Instead of reacting to skyrocketing house insurance rates, why don't they do something proactive and go out and find how we can try and ensure that the rates aren't going to keep going up? There may be ways of tinkering with it. I don't know. It's different than auto insurance, which is mandatory. House insurance is slightly different. Maybe the system can be fixed. I really don't know enough about it. But let's have this new insurance review board go out and do that. Do a review, take a look at what's happening, and decide how we can try and improve the system. That would be very helpful. And I would hope the government would have looked at that. But instead, no, that isn't part of this. They go into great detail. In fact, they've already advertised for the positions. I can imagine they probably weren't hoping for a minority government so they could get a bunch of their friends on the board. But we're now at a stage, Mr. Speaker, where with a minority government and the Human Resources Committee divided 3, it's going to be an opportunity for the best candidates to come forward so that all parties have an opportunity to ensure that the best candidates are on the board. Mr. Speaker, one of the other things that I think is very, very important about this legislation is facility association. Now, it's always been treated differently because up until this law, well, up until now, until this law passes, if you had regular auto insurance, your company just had to file the fact that they were raising rates. They didn't have to go out and apply and get approval. Now, under this law, they're going to have to do that, which I think we've said it had to be done anyway. That's a minimum. Well, Mr. Speaker, Facility Association always had to get approval through the UARB, the Utility and Review Board, but they're not covered by this 20% rate cut. Facility Association will not be forced to reduce their rates by 20%. These are the drivers with the most serious records. It's the ones the insurance companies have to provide insurance to, but at very high rates. But the fact is those rates have gone up astronomically as well. And I would suggest that cutting them by 20% may not be a bad idea as well, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to see that done. But this legislation exempts Facility Association from the rate cut. Again, the hand of the insurance companies is all over it, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's important that people understand that these insurance companies, the IBC and others, clearly have had a hand in how this legislation was drafted. And the people who lose because of it are the consumers in Nova Scotia, the people who do not have an opportunity to try and have a say. They thought they were having a say during the election. You know, the member from Richmond the other day said 37 of the 52 members of this House were elected to stand for private insurance. I understand that. I do. But the fact is that most Nova Scotians, when they see this legislation and see the impact of it, will probably next time elect 37 people who want public auto insurance, because this system is not fixed by this legislation. It creates more regulation, more complication. And I think one of the other members of the House said earlier, and they're right, the amount of complicated regulation in this law will mean more work for lawyers, not less. I know, having never practiced private law, but I think I understand a little bit about practicing private law, Mr. Speaker, as a lawyer, that the fact is that lawyers are very good. Even if you try and minimize the amount of litigation by saying, here's a definition for minor injury, lawyers will find a way to litigate over the definition of minor injury. They'll find a way. They're like, someone tried to say the other day the word mercurial, that you'll fall in, it's like mercury. You put mercury in something, it will fall into the cracks. It will find a way to slip through the cracks. Well, Mr. Speaker, Many a lawyer in this province will find a way to slip through the cracks of this law, and as a means of trying to ensure that they can continue to get billing for this. And I may be the only lawyer in the House other than the assistant clerk who's here, because he keeps looking at me like. But I think he practiced public law as well, so I don't think he necessarily should feel offended by this. So. Those with clean hands, right? Anyway, Mr. Speaker, I think that, as I said, there's many things in this bill that I don't like. I will not be voting for this legislation. I have concerns with it. There are ways of ensuring that Nova Scotians can get better. And if I can say, Mr. Speaker, if this is about saying, look, 37 of 52 members of this House were elected to support private insurance, support the private market system, fine. But there's better ways of fixing it than this. Let's have a much more clear definition of minor injury that protects Nova Scotians who have more than whiplash. Let's make sure that the discount rate is 2.5%, not 3.25%, so they get a fair return if they happen to have serious injury. Let's ensure that the Schedule B benefits are there for everyone and are not something you have to buy like French fries on top of your regular insurance, Mr. Speaker. Let's ensure that Facility Association also have to be reduced by 20%. These are things that we can do to improve this legislation. This government came forward with legislation that the IBC was rubbing its hands to see passed as quickly as possible. But as members of this House, even if you think you were elected to be here to support the private free market system of providing auto insurance, then you have a right to, you have a duty to your constituents, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that those members that live in your riding have a good system that works for them. This is not it, and it's time it be changed, Mr. Speaker, with amendments to ensure that Nova Scotians get a system that works for them. Thank you.
Recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to stand in my place here today and say a few words about this bill. And I couldn't help but pay particular attention to the eloquence of the House Leader for the NDP. And, you know, I might say at the outset, Mr. Speaker, trying to make some sense out of an NDP position on something is like trying to grab smoke. You know, you just can't do it because there's no substance to it. And this bill is no exception to other bills that the NDP have brought before this House or have talked about in this particular House. But I'm going to get to that in a moment. But here, you know, the eloquent House Leader and his leader before him waxed eloquently today about the fact that they were going to try to improve this bill, and then they were going to vote against it. That's what they said. They're going to try to make the bill better, and then they're going to vote against it. The House Leader stood in this place today, and before he even sees any amendments, he informs this House today that the NDP are going to vote against this bill. At least he is, anyway. At least he is. I can go back to another point in time in this House when the member from Halifax-Shabukdale voted against our budget without even seeing it. He was asked by the scribes whether or not he was going to support the budget that was coming before the House, and he said no. And they said, well, do you know what's in it? No, but you're not supporting it anyway. And he said, no, I'm not. In other words, they had a preset of mind that they were going to bring the government down because they weren't going to support a budget that they didn't even see. So that was, yes. The member from Dartmouth North says, yes, they did. That's right. But what they missed was that they thought they were going to take government when they did that, and they got fooled. Because, Mr. Speaker, the people of Nova Scotia will vote for the NDP until they think they're going to form a government, and then they jump ship because they don't want to trust the finances of the province to the socialists. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, I want to turn my attention to the issue at hand here for a moment, which is Bill number 1, and to say again that it's hard to tell where the Socialist Party is coming from here, because now they're following the lead of the Liberal Party in talking about certain amendments that they want to see in this bill. But, Mr. Speaker, there are important considerations here that we should be talking about regarding this bill and other financial issues that are facing Nova Scotians today, particularly Nova Scotians on fixed incomes, seniors, people who are hard-pressed to pay their bills, yet they're facing heavy, heavy costs for car insurance, heavy costs for home insurance, tremendous costs for other types of insurance that they have to have. Gasoline prices have gone through the roof. Home heating oil is set to take off as the weather gets colder. And we have to address all these issues, Mr. Speaker, and we have to address them with the best interests of the people of Nova Scotia in mind. And, Mr. Speaker, those issues are issues that are all going to come before this House at one point or another. Now, Mr. Speaker, over the next few weeks and months, we're going to be hearing these stories about insurance continuing to rise, house insurance. I agree with the House Leader for the NDP that perhaps house insurance will take a hike now because of the recent disaster and other factors that may come into play. We have to be ready to deal with that, Mr. Speaker, and I'm a little bit disappointed that perhaps we're not addressing the whole question of consumer insurance in this province, not just the one issue on car insurance. But we are dealing with car insurance now in Bill 1, And certainly the others deserve some attention in the near future, because I believe we're going to be back here talking about other forms of insurance in the near future. But you know, Mr. Speaker, a couple of years ago, the Liberal Party knew there was going to be a problem here, and we asked the other two parties in this House, the government and the NDP, to get together with us and form a tripartite committee to take a look at it, an all-party committee to take a look at it, and guess what, Mr. Speaker, we were turned down in our request. Because the government had its own agenda. They wanted to try to smooth this issue over until they got to an election and perhaps passed an election. The NDP, on the other hand, wanted to use it as an election issue. They didn't care, Mr. Speaker, whether it was solved. They wanted to use it as an election issue. And they put out, Mr. Speaker, this grand scheme of public insurance. Grand scheme of public insurance. Well, you're still over here. You know, the people of Nova Scotia obviously turned you down because you're still over here. So they didn't buy the hocus pocus of the NDP on public insurance during the last election. And Mr. Speaker, I will make reference to the fact that they've introduced a bill. It's a poor cousin to Bill 1. As bad as Bill 1 is, this one is a poor cousin to it. This is the extent of the NDP bill that's before this House on public insurance. It has 2 cover sheets, Mr. Speaker, 2 cover sheets, and 14 lines, Mr. Speaker, in between the 2 cover sheets. And the operative clause that I would remind Nova Scotians of is that it's going to take years, if not months, if not years, to set it up. And guess what, Mr. Speaker? The monies required for the purpose of this act shall be paid out of monies appropriated by the legislature. In other words, the taxpayer is going to pay for it in spades, if that ever got. But this is the total extent of that bill. There it is here. That's how much the NDP think about the public insurance plan that they put forward. What they've done is try to fool Nova Scotians into thinking they're going to be better off in a public system in this province, and it's not going to work, and they know it's not going to work, and they couldn't even put anything on paper to suggest they had an idea to put out there to Nova Scotians that it would work. Nova Scotians didn't believe it then, and they're not believing it now. And when the truth comes out, they'll be happy that they didn't go down that road. Now, Mr. Speaker, this bill we have before us is one that we cannot support in its present context. This bill is one that needs improvement, Mr. Speaker. We realize that. We realize that this bill is a bill that needs substantial improvement. And I believe that fair-minded individuals like the members that are in this House, from all sides of this House, would agree that the people of this province should have a say in law amendments as to what they think the ultimate bill should be when it leaves this House, the ultimate end for this bill, whether it goes through the required procedures of the House or whether it's killed somewhere along the way. But, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to see this bill killed. I don't want to see this bill killed because this bill will improve the situation for Nova Scotia consumers as it affects their ability to pay car insurance and the rates they're going to pay. But, Mr. Speaker, I want this bill improved substantially. There are some wording in this, there's wording in this bill, there are amounts in this bill, there are perhaps some indications from the government that they're willing to take a look at amendments. Well, the amendments are going to have to be substantial, Mr. Speaker. But here we are, Mr. Speaker, as a party, and you heard our leader say earlier today that we want to work with the government on this particular issue. We want to work to get a better bill out of this House so that consumers will see that this government and all parties in this House are trying to do something for them. That's what we want to do. And we want to address the issue, Mr. Speaker, of other types of insurance in this province. I still say, Mr. Speaker, we should be setting up an all-party committee of this House to look at some other problems that facing consumers when it comes to home heating oil, when it comes to home insurance, when it comes to gasoline tax in this province. All these matters need to be looked at by the legislators that occupy these 52 chairs. Doesn't make any difference what party they belong to. We have a responsibility to stop this price gouging of consumers in this province. Now, Mr. Speaker, our leader said today that we have to cooperate here in the best interests of the people that we serve, the people that are out there, the consumers, the taxpayers, the people of Nova Scotia. We have a responsibility to do that. What we do not have, Mr. Speaker, what we should not have is a preset approach to what we're going to do in this House. What we should not have, Mr. Speaker, is a closed mind towards making this bill work. And unfortunately, that's what we have from the NDP. The NDP have said no matter what improvements are made in this bill, they're going to vote against it. So by their logic, if we decide to do that, if we decide to vote against this bill because we don't like the improvements that are being made in the bill, that doesn't satisfy our concerns in the bill, then the bill will fail. So if the bill fails, who are the losers? The consumers of this province are the losers, because the insurance companies will then go back to having their way with the consumers, and they will say that the legislature couldn't get its act together, so we'll continue to put high prices on the bills in this province. Well, they say, look at our bill. Well, here's the 2 empty pages and the 14 lines. That's their bill. 14 lines, and at the end of it, there was much thought given to how they were going to pay for it. They just said the taxpayer will pay for it. The taxpayer will pay for it. That's all. You and I and every other taxpayer in the province will pay for it. I think the only question would be is how long before it would go broke. Well, we'll have a chance to discuss. In law amendments and in clause by clause whether or not we can make an analogy between what's happening in Nova Scotia with your position, the position of the NDP, and what's happening in the other 2 provinces. We have, Mr. Speaker, before us a bill that Nova Scotians are looking to pass through this House. We have before us a bill that Nova Scotians are demanding that we deal with. It was the #1 issue in the last election in my area, and I'm sure, aside from health care, which always seems to be the #1 issue, but insurance was on everybody's minds because of the tremendous increases in costs over the past couple of years. We all heard the horror stories of insurance costs going up in a family from $800 to $2,800. If one member of a family lost a license, they were charging other members of the family a higher risk premium, all of those things. We all heard those stories. And Mr. Speaker, we all felt, I think, somewhat of obliged to tell them people that were telling us these stories that we're going to try to make their life a little bit better as it respects payment of car insurance. But you know, there are problems with oversimplification of how this whole system works in Nova Scotia. Sometimes we try to oversimplify it, and sometimes people just want to hear they're going to pay less money. But along with that comes considerations. What type of insurance are you getting? For example, I look at some public insurance programs that the NDP are so proud of trotting out. But, you know, there are 2 types of insurance, and that story hasn't come out, that you can buy a basic insurance policy perhaps through a public insurance plan, but if you want enhanced insurance, if you want a lower liability, or if you want to buy some collisions and with lower deductibility, or if you want to buy enhanced comprehensive programs, theft, and all of those things, guess what, Mr. Speaker? You might have to go back to a private carrier. So instead of dealing with one carrier, you're going to be dealing with a public carrier for liability and basic insurance, and a private carrier for the so-called frills insurance. So the consumer could end up going shopping anyway in the private sector for enhanced insurance. That's something that we have to pay some attention to. Also, Mr. Speaker, we have to tell the people of Nova Scotia that we're on their side when it comes to this. We're not on the side of the insurance company or the lawyers or vested interest groups or big unions or people like that, or any vested interest group, all of which have a role to play in our society, and I'm not saying they don't. All I'm saying is our role should be there to protect the consumer. The person that their only advocate is the 52 people sitting in here. We are the people that have to look out for the consumers of this province. Because nobody else really takes that as their primary concern. It may be their secondary concern, but it should be our primary concern. That is why, Mr. Speaker, we should try to make this bill as good as we can make it. As good as we can make it. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, we can do that over the next few weeks. When this bill goes to law amendments, we're going to have an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to hear from Nova Scotians. We're going to hear from the insurance companies. We're going to hear from the lawyers. We're going to hear from people who are involved in the car business. We're going to hear people who are involved in all types who have vested interests. We're going to hear from all of those. But the people I hope we hear from are the people who are being affected badly by this bill, who have paid tremendous costs for insurance in the past couple of years and need relief. Those are the people that I think that the Law Amendments Committee and ultimately the Committee of the whole House here should be dealing with. The concerns, because everybody else, Mr. Speaker, is going to have a vested interest. They're going to come at it from their perspective, from their point of view. And they're going to do it by suggesting that if you accept their point of view, then you're accepting the consumer's point of view. And Mr. Speaker, that is not the case. That should not be the case. What should be the case is that all parties of this House should be listening to the people who come before the Law Amendments Committee with legitimate concerns. The same people that have called us. The same people who are looking for relief from insurance. Not only car insurance, you're going to hear it in law amendments. People perhaps will be cautioned that they're straying off the mark, but they're going to get in there. They're going to be talking about house insurance. They're going to be talking about home heating oil insurance or home heating oil costs. They're going to be talking about all energy costs and insurance costs at some point in time. But I think, Mr. Speaker, what we have to do is act as an advocate for the people of Nova Scotia in determining how this legislation is finally going to roll out. And Mr. Speaker, it's not in the best interest of anybody for a particular party in this House, be it the government or our party or the NDP, to take the easy way out and abandon ship when it comes to dealing with this piece of legislation. Because if that happens and this legislation doesn't go forward, the ones that are going to be adversely affected are the consumers of this province. And Mr. Speaker, you don't want to see that. I don't want to see that. I don't think anybody in this House wants to see that. Because the alternative to not having this legislation go forward in a much improved form will be no legislation, status quo for another period of time. No matter how you want to cut it, no matter what grand schemes this party has, or we have, or anybody else has, it'll be months, if not years, before we get back at this bill again. So it's our responsibility, Mr. Speaker, to get the best possible deal we can for the consumers of this province in this session of the legislature. So relief will come now for the consumers of this province, not in 6 months' time, not in a year's time, or heaven forbid, not another study to go out there and look at it. We're the people that are getting paid to make decisions here, and we have to make a decision on this bill during this session of the legislature, and it has to be a decision that the consumers are going to be satisfied with and that we, all three parties in this House, can live with. Now, it disturbs me that one party has already said they're going to vote against it. That, to me, tells me that there's no compromise here, that they, if they don't get their bill exactly the way they want it, then the consumers are of no consequence. Because it's the consumers that are going to suffer in this province if we don't get a resolve to this bill. It's the consumers of Nova Scotia, the people who pay automobile tax and insurance in this province, pay automobile insurance, are going to continue to pay high rates unless we deal with this issue. And what we have to do is deal with it to get the best and fairest deal for Nova Scotians. And Mr. Speaker, I could go on for 2 or 3 hours, and I know you'd love me to do that, but I just want to say, in concluding my remarks for now, because I will probably be having something more to say on this issue at law amendments. But, Mr. Speaker, I would hope that this bill gets to law amendments as quickly as possible so we can hear from the people who count, the people of Nova Scotia. And I hope that they take the opportunity to come to the law amendments in the other chamber and to express their concerns to that committee. And Mr. Speaker, I think this legislature has an opportunity here to really listen to Nova Scotians and an obligation to make this bill the best possible bill that it can be. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Hants East.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm glad to actually have an opportunity to speak to this bill. Mr. Speaker, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling the squeeze. It seems if I go to the bank, which is not very far away, while the house sits, I just go across the street here. But if I was to take out $100, I would almost swear that I can't get back to the legislature and it's gone. And I think that there are a lot of Nova Scotians that when they get their paycheck, it evaporates in their hand, or they feel like it evaporates in their hand before they actually get to do much with it in regard to their families. Now, somewhere along the line, I got the impression that there's an awful lot of people making a lot of money off of me. Now, I might be, strongly misled, but that's sure the feeling that I get. Now, a fine example, I think, is the insurance industry, the automobile insurance industry. I don't hear of any of those companies hurting particularly badly. Profits in the billions. Now, their only complaint is the profits aren't high enough. Not that they're not making any, they're just not high enough. Now, I'm all for the private sector. I'm all for businesses making money. Matter of fact, that's a good thing. When it comes to corporations making money, I say, come on in, make $1 million, make $1 billion, just don't make my kids sick. Don't pollute my air, don't pollute my water. But if you want to make money, come here. If you have a service to sell and it's competitive, great. But when it comes to auto insurance, Mr. Speaker, the world is not designed exactly that way. Because the government tells you, you got to have it. You got to have some coverage. Matter of fact, there's pretty few things as far as products that you have to buy that the government tells you you have to have it. But this is one. You got to have auto insurance. Now, it would seem a fairly sensible line of thinking that if the government tells you you have to have it, that maybe the government would be interested to see that there's a fairly reasonably priced product out there for you to buy to meet that demand that they tell you that you need to have. But there isn't. Not for Nova Scotians. Matter of fact, you're thrown into the pit of insurance companies, and they dictate to you what they're going to offer you and what price, and if you can't afford it, well, too bad. Well, I've heard a lot so far, and from members of the Liberal caucus, members of my own caucus. And certainly I'll be the first to stand here and admit I have a bias. I think a lot more of what the members of my own caucus have said. Now, Mr. Speaker, we do have a bill before this House, Bill 4. The thrust of our legislation is to bring in public auto, or driver-owned auto, whatever you want to call it. Now, if we...
I wonder if the member would allow for an introduction.
Certainly.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member from Dartmouth North on an introduction.
Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member from Hants East for allowing me to do this introduction. Mr. Speaker, in the Speaker's gallery, there are two individual constituents of mine from Dartmouth North. One is a Patrick Kane, who is studying international development, and another, Bridget LaRue, who has just graduated from Cornell University in a study in medical policy. I'd like the both of you to rise and receive the warm welcome of this House.
Thank you and welcome to all our visitors in the House this afternoon. The Honourable Member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So as I said, I have a bias, which most in the House would expect that I would have. So, now if our alternative to this Tory legislation, this public auto, if this was the first time on the face of the earth that this type of legislation was mentioned, I could understand the skeptics. Matter of fact, that would be a healthy way to go about debate on our legislation. But what I don't understand is the fact that those provinces that have public auto are models we can look at. And yet, that means it's not the first time that this type of insurance has come before any province. And the people there like it. It serves their needs, it's cost effective, and it means that any dollars made in those systems stays in the province. The jobs created by those corporations stay in the province. Now, the Premier, during the election campaign, he talked about creating 30,000 jobs in Nova Scotia. But yet he turns his back on a notion of a corporation that would employ more people. He's willing to let our money go to Amsterdam, to whatever other foreign country that our premiums go to keep those jobs, but not willing to invest in Nova Scotians for the jobs that could be created here, and that their dollars could go back into the Nova Scotia economy.
I wonder if the member would allow for another introduction. Thank you. The Honourable Member from Colchester Musquodoboit Valley on an introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Honourable member for Hants East for yielding the floor just for a moment. As you know, Mr. Speaker, and of course the Honourable Member for Hants East, that we are having an emergency debate in here this evening, and attendance sometimes during the late debate and emergency debate isn't perhaps what we would like to see. I would like at this time to collectively, through you, Mr. Speaker, introduce rural Nova Scotia. We're well represented here, the various commodities. There's cattle, there's dairy, there's certainly sheep, and the hog industry is introduced. And I wonder if our guests would rise, because farmers feed us all. I wonder if our guests would rise and receive a round of applause from members of the House.
And again, welcome to our members. The Honourable Member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to welcome the people in the gallery as well. I'm glad Brooke mentioned sheep producers, so it's one of the good things you've said lately. So, Mr. Speaker, so we do have models that we can look at. Now, there are probably negative components as well as positive components to these models. And it seems that whenever the members of the Liberal caucus get up to speak, they always seem to pick what could be a negative side and add a twist to it that would tend to make you think that there's something completely wrong with all the positive things of public auto. And we've made the case, actually, we spent a lot of time studying this issue. And actually, we would beg the other caucuses to do the same if they're interested at all in offering a better deal to Nova Scotians. Those models are there. They don't have to take our word for them, how well they work. There are other people they can go talk to, not us, that would tell them the exact same thing. We have heard comments from the minister responsible for high auto insurance rates that the reason that the rates in Manitoba are so low is because the roads are flat. Well, one thing I want to tell the minister is that public auto insurance in Manitoba, that corporation, has given money back to the province to spend on roads. Now, we've heard a lot said about the fact that the taxpayer is going to have to pick up the tab for this, that these businesses, these corporations will go broke, and the taxpayer will have to carry it. We've heard it aligned the same as Sydney Steel, for example. That has never happened in those three provinces. In Manitoba, 30 years ago, it cost them over $300,000 to set up their public auto insurance corporation. They borrowed that money from the province. They paid it back in a year with interest. They have given money to the province for their roads, something that the private industry here gives very little back, if any. This is something that's worth doing because you don't have to make a profit in a public system. You only have to cover your costs and pay your premiums. The bill before us, a 20% reduction. Well, if there's a good thing I can say about that, then that's 5% more than the Liberals were promoting during the last election. They were offering a 15% reduction. But considering that rates have gone up 60 and 65%, that means they're going to stay up 40 and 45% to the consumer. That's not much of a reduction when there's been no clear evidence of why that's happened. It certainly hasn't been the cost of lawyers. It hasn't been payouts or awards awarded by judges. There's been no evidence of any of this as the reasons for the high cost of auto insurance. Matter of fact, the only thing that we can find, it was the insurance industry's losses on the stock market. Great. I mean, wouldn't we all love to invest our money and then go back to people and turn on the tap and make them give it all back? Gee, we lost it, but we can just jack up premiums and get that money. Under the public system, since you don't have to make a profit, there's no need for that. But you can set your premiums to cover your costs. And what members may not know is recently, a year ago or so, there was an election in British Columbia. The Liberal government was going to privatize BC Auto, publicly owned auto insurance. It was the insurance brokers who campaigned against the government, persuaded the government not to privatize it. They said, keep it public. It's working. In all of those provinces, successive Liberal and Tory governments, as the change occurred, have never gotten rid of public auto. Now, if this is something that the public, as has been stated here, that the majority of the seats in this House are against public auto because the New Democrats don't have enough seats to compare to both the Liberals and the Tories, that therefore we lost that argument at the polls. Well, maybe we did. But maybe we lost the articulation of that argument because people believe still that their government will look out for them. Now, why they would believe that after 4 years of Tory government is beyond me. I can't come up with a reason. But people still believe when someone looks them in the eye and says, I'm going to help you, that Jay will. And that's what people believe in that election. They're stinging from high auto insurance rates. They have been for some time. But they believed when the Tories brought in the freeze, as much as we said it's no freeze, they believed it was. And then they started to get their new bills. And their rate had gone up. It wasn't frozen. Now the Premier says he's going to bring in legislation similar to what Bernard Lord brought in that didn't work. People believe it'll work here. What makes this even worse is the fact that it caps the claims. In other words, this is what the insurance industry wants. They'll accept a reduction, I think. The government must know more than I do on this because maybe they're not going to accept it. But they wanted a cap on what they pay out to their clients. Now, there's a great way to do business. Have the government legislate that you have to pay out less, or you can pay out less, to the people who are paying your premiums. I don't see any benefit to Nova Scotians under this system. Now, there might possibly be an improvement in the present situation if they can get a 20% reduction and no cap, that policyholders can actually get all of what their policy says with no cap and still have a reduction in the premium. Now, that would be a step forward for consumers, and that's what we've heard, how this has got to be a benefit to the consumer. Now, the honourable member from Cape Breton South, he alluded to the Law Amendments Committee. Now, members or guests here today may not be aware of what that means. In Nova Scotia, we are one of, if not the only, we're certainly one of the few legislatures in the country that has the public come in and speak to pieces of legislation for changes that they would like to see. And actually, I feel quite proud to be a member of a legislature that happens. But what bothers me is that I've seen lineups of people come in and speak to legislation that no changes occurred in. That they wanted something done. They wanted an amendment. That's what it's called, law amendments. So they wanted that law amended. And they saw this as an opportunity to speak directly to politicians about that piece of legislation. And they filed in here sometime 2 or 3 days in a row. And quite often with the same request. But yet it never happened. And you know why it never happened, Mr. Speaker? Because it wasn't in the government's agenda. The government had an agenda, it was going forward with it, and this was a nice thing that they were going to do for the public. Let them come in and speak, let them think that they were going to have an impact, and say thank you very much, and then push the bill through the way it was. Now, people are of the impression that minority government is the best government, that minority government can work. Well, I was here in '98. I've had the fortune or misfortune. I heard someone say that in the history of Nova Scotia that we've had 3 minority governments, and I've been here for 2 of them. Now, I wasn't overly impressed with how this government worked in '98. Some people thought it was fine. I didn't. What I thought was there was a coalition between the Liberals and Tories. When it came to trying to get substantive changes on anything, I felt we were shut out. My impression is that's what will happen because this piece of legislation brought in by the Tories is a Liberal piece of legislation. There are 2 bills before this House on auto insurance. There's the Tory bill and there's the NDP bill. There's no Liberal bill. And there's a reason for that, because this is the Liberal bill. I have a lot of faith in Nova Scotians, especially when they're given all the information they need. And I feel for people because I would wonder, if I was out on the street listening to what goes on in here, I'd be shaking my head. And I'd be saying, who do I believe? Everybody tries to make an argument, tries to promote their case, and in doing that, to the people, the average person on the street, it seems purely spin.
Member Cape Breton West on the point of order.
No, Mr. Speaker. I was just wondering if the honourable member would entertain a short question.
Member Hants East, entertain a question.
Certainly, Mr. Speaker.
Member Cape Breton West on the question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for accepting the question. Simply put, would the honourable member be willing to submit to all members of the legislature and indeed to the people of Nova Scotia the cost estimates, the detail surrounding this proposed legislation that they indicate that they have, because we haven't been able to see any detail on cost estimates whatsoever. We really are looking for detail.
The all member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. I think if he looks at our legislation, he'll see that there's a commissioner appointed for 6 months. That would be where that detail will be worked out. I can tell him if he wants to work with rough numbers, he can extrapolate, with inflation, et cetera, from the Manitoba model and come up with roughly $2 million cost. But that can be more finely worked in that 6-month period. So.
Pay back in 2 years, too. Pay back in 2 years. That's the way it was done.
Order, please. Honourable Member Hans East has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But I encourage the honourable member from Cape Breton West, as much as I can encourage the honourable member from Cape Breton West, that he doesn't have to take our word for it. That these models exist. They can do their own research and see where on the mark, how close that number of 2 million might come to set up that bureaucracy. I'm sure there are people there who'd be more than happy to. And actually, in British Columbia, there's a Liberal government, and I'm sure that so. I thought you should have our bill in your billfold. I thought, but. Well, I thought during the last campaign, our leader had airplane tickets he offered for a member from the Tory caucus and from the Liberal caucus to go west and examine those models. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Maybe it is true that if you throw a rock in amongst a bunch of dogs and one yelps, you hit somebody. So I'll consider that my rock. Mr. Speaker, the basis for what we do here is the people of Nova Scotia. Government has no other function. It exists for no other reason. We do the things for people through those departments that they cannot do for themselves. They can't be out working on the roads and trying to make a living. They can't be trying to give themselves their own medical care. The province collects their taxes to offer them service, and that's the function of government, to see that they get services for their dollar. What's happening to Nova Scotians more and more is they're paying and paying and paying and getting less and less and less. They're actually getting horrible roads, but paying gas taxes, cuts in health care. The relevancy, as I heard a member say, I don't see the relevancy. The relevancy of this is that we're here for the people of Nova Scotia. This bill has to work for the people of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. And I make the contention that this bill does not work for the people of Nova Scotia. This bill falls short of what we can do for the people of Nova Scotia.
Would the honourable member like to move adjournment debate, please?
Adjournment debate, Mr. Speaker.
Motion to adjourn debate, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Government House Leader on tomorrow's hours and order of business.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I move the House to now adjourn to meet again tomorrow at the hour of 9 a.m. The House will sit from 9 a.m. till 3 p.m. The order of business will be Bill number 1, second reading, following the daily routine. Mr. Speaker, if we complete the second reading of Bill number 1, the House will adjourn at that time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Motion the House adjourn until tomorrow at 9 a.m. All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Just for an explanation of the members and then visitors in the House, earlier today a motion was put forward by the Honourable Member for Hants East under Rule 43 that the business of the House be set aside to allow for an urgent debate, an issue that's believed to be of urgency in this province, be debated this evening. There was an all-agreement party in the House that that debate would take place this evening. There'll be 2 hours of debate, so it'll go from 6 p.m. till 8 p.m. Three members from each party will speak, 2 15 minutes each, and the third 10 minutes each. So the honourable member who moved the motion will be first to speak to the emergency debate. It's the honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you. I think that's what's called a smattering of applause, but thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I have to say that it's my regret that I speak to this debate, and actually my regret to feel the need to call this debate. The major thrust of this debate was to center around the lack of BSE support for Nova Scotia cattlemen, dairy producers, and sheep producers. And I think that if the Speaker and other members of this House who are from rural Nova Scotia would be aware, certainly, that agriculture has been hit and hit hard, certainly since this spring, and with the flood at the end of March, and certainly the valley farmers who actually got more rain than most of